A Rabbinic Anthology, selected with an introduction by C.G. Montefiore, will be in our third part of that, and H.Loewe. They did not indulge in games and sports. They took strolls, apparently, but no hard exercise. They had no female companionship or friends. They were fond of and even obedient to their wives, but these wives did not share with them their studies or interests. Their world was small. They did not look much beyond the synagogue and the house of study. They wanted only to be let alone, to study the law in peace and quiet. The world around was, for the most part, an alien world, an adverse world, which despised them and which they despised. Modern Jews have used the rabbinic literature as an unfailing source from which to make elegant extracts for apologetic purposes. But the literature itself is not apologetic. It is entirely honest. It was not written for the purposes of propaganda. Nowadays, people quote its most horrible portions for propaganda. There is no eyewash about it. One has no need to ask, is this for outside use? It is wholly sincere. The good and fine and wise things are just as much for the expression of the minds of the rabbis as the things which we regard as crude or cheap or intolerant or silly. Nothing is artificial. As I have said elsewhere, the rabbis are always in undress. What I have said about women needs some enlargement. The rabbinic literature is written by men and for men. The difference in the relations of men and women to each other makes a constant difference between the rabbis and ourselves. It is always cropping up. Modern apologists tend to ignore or evade it. They quote a few sentences such as who is rich, who has a good wife, or they tell of a few exceptional women such as Beruria. It is quite true that wife and mother played a very important part in rabbinic life. It is true that the rabbis were almost always monogamists. It is true that they honored their mothers profoundly and usually honored and cared for their wives. But that is only one side of the story. Women, children, and slaves, that familiar and frequent collocation means and reveals a great deal. Women were, on the whole, regarded as inferior to men in mind and function and in status, and Christianity hardly did any better with that. Very few women were students of the law. It was not intended that they should be, yet the highest and most adorable thing in the world was to study the law. The greatest and purest joy in the world was to fulfill all the commandments and ordinances of the Pentateuch and rabbinic codes. But women need not and could not observe them all. It was not for nothing that the daily blessing was said, the blessing which the modern Orthodox Jews have not had the courage and good sense to remove from their prayer books. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, who hast not made me a woman. This blessing was as sincerely said as the two previous ones. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, who hast not made me a Gentile or a slave. Now let us remember that Gentile is not the same thing as not being Jewish. A sectarian Jew is also a Gentile. I think the word used is Guya are Gawim in the plural, which means those who turn their backs on God. Social intercourse with women was usually taboo. They were the source of moral danger. They were the incitements to depravity and lust, the evil impulse. The Yetzer Hara is especially and mainly the impulse which leads to sexual impurity. The result was not entirely healthy. The rabbis were prevailingly chaste. There was probably much less adultery and fornication among the rabbis than among us. People nowadays try to say, oh, Catholic versus Protestant, and it's like, it turns out there's not really the difference. Even though the Catholic clergy can't get married, it's more about which country you're in, right? But this chastity was obtained at a certain cost. The lack of healthy, simple companionship and friendship caused a constant dwelling upon sexual relations and details. In the rabbinic literature, sexual allusions are very frequent. Immense are the halakhic discussions about the details of sex life and the sexual phenomena. Repel nature and it recurs. Repress it and it grows up again. And not always in a healthy form, where we should not dream of thinking that any sexual desire could be evoked. The rabbis were always on the watch for it, dwelling on it, suggesting it, though they were almost invariably married men. They yet seem to have often been oddly tormented by sexual desires, perhaps too. The very absence of natural and healthy social intercourse between men and women drove them to dwell, theoretically, with a double frequency upon every sort of sexual details and minutiae. This tendency was hardly characteristic of the age. The patristic literature is similarly marked. On the other hand, the rabbinic writings do not eulogize virginity and monasticism. H.L. And yeah, they do address everything that they could have thought of. If there were robots back then, they would have included some of that stuff, right? Another point to remember in regard to rabbinic literature is that it comes from men whose outlook was extraordinarily limited. They had no interest outside religion and law, and they had lost all historic sense. C.P. Colton, Captain Colton in Taylor's Great Events in History, 1934, page 212, on the Middle Ages, the scarcity of books, even at the best of times, and the comparatively limited migration of such books as existed were responsible for a painful rarity of historical sense and method. They had no interest in art, in drama, in belles lettres, in poetry, or in science, except perhaps in medicine. They had no training in philosophy. How enormously they might have benefited if, under competent teachers, they had been put through a course of Greek philosophy and literature. Now, Christianity was the one that really came down hard on philosophy. In its basic teachings. They had no training in rhetoric or the art of composition. That is one reason why the written precipitate of their teachings and discussions is so formless and shapeless. The Old Testament was practically the only book they possessed, but of an appreciation of the Hebrew Bible as literature, we notice little. For them, the Bible is a collection of texts and isolated utterances, of injunctions, proofs, and teachings. Yet this Bible, with all that is, implied is their world, their one overmastering interest. They picked up, it is true, many current ideas, opinions, superstitions, in a fluid, unsystematic form. The comparison of the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud will make a lot of that clear. But all that was by the way and incidental. The total result is very strange. The literature from which my anthology has to be drawn is, I should fancy, unlike any other. It contains a religion so far as one may speak of a single rabbinic religion, which, while based upon and derived from the Hebrew Bible, is yet in many ways higher than the average religion of that Bible, higher, purer, and more developed. On the other hand, in some respects it falls below the finest and noblest portions of the Hebrew Bible, and it has a few infiltrations of superstitions alien to the Old Testament at its best. Well, some of those sexual things that are talked about as allowed are quite against what's taught. Although the Bible doesn't require, the Christian side of the Bible didn't require consent for marriage from either male or female either, so, It may be asked, what is our present modern interest in the religious teachings of the rabbis? There is obviously a special Jewish interest, but there is also, I think, a general interest. The rabbinic literature is required to illustrate the New Testament. This specific New Testament interest I have myself done something to satisfy so far as the synoptic gospels are concerned in a former volume, but I trust that the rabbinic religion has a yet wider appeal. Genealogically, one may say that from the Judaism of 20 of the Common Era, there sprang all Christianity and all later Judaism. Now, the Judaism of 20 of the Common Era was the offspring of the Hebrew Bible, which is still a living book and is a portion of the sacred scripture of Christianity. Well, the Catholic Pentateuch is a leading translation, as you would call it. So there's interpolations to lean you towards certain doctrines. But in the general sense, yeah, they picked up the Jewish scripture. It is then surely of interest to know something of the direct heir of the Hebrew Bible, for that is what Rabbinic Judaism is. Again, if we examine the Christianity of 500 of the Common Era, we might say that it has two main strands. One, a Jewish strand, the teaching of Jesus and partly of Paul. Two, a Greek strand, which, visible already in the fourth Gospel, became much stronger and more definite later on. But Rabbinic Judaism is purely Jewish. And of course, we need to remember that Judaism by name didn't occur until a Greek book called Second Maccabees. Of course, that specific type of Judaism probably goes back to about 200 BCE. It has no Greek strand. Whether the absence of the second strand was an advantage is disputable. I think it was, in many respects, a disadvantage, but whether advantage or disadvantage, this purely native development from the Old Testament is certainly interesting. The Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible, may be regarded as the parent both of Christianity and of Rabbinic Judaism. The debt of the former to the Old Testament is much less than that of the latter, for there are no such religious geniuses and innovators as Jesus, Paul, and the author of the fourth Gospel among the rabbis. Well, the fourth Gospel was a rewrite of something from 4 centuries earlier, and some of the prayers, that was about Bacchus, but And some of the prayers, for example, are, again, about that old Jewish prayers. Well, I mean, they didn't call it Judaism back then, but what you could call following the rabbis and stuff probably started 540 BCE. Well, I mean, as what you could call Judaism. I don't know if that's quite how you define, but anyways, in one sentence. But moreover, for good and for evil, Christianity owes much to Hellenic and Hellenistic thought and influences, whereas Rabbinic Judaism is almost purely a native growth and depends upon the Old Testament alone. In its own opinion, it is merely the drawing out and the filling out of the Old Testament, which to it is the undiluted and unchangeable Word of God. Nevertheless, Rabbinic Judaism is a development. The child, often for good, sometimes for evil, is different from the parent, and to those who stand a little apart, both from Rabbinic Judaism and from Christianity, and contemplate them with a certain amount of impartiality and detachment, it can be of real interest to note, not merely their obvious differences, but their likeness, and yet more, the way in which the one is often, in a good sense, the complement or the supplement of the other. For even in their developments beyond the Old Testament, there are likenesses, but more often, I believe, the good development in ethical and religious, not in dogmatic religious teaching of the one is not the same as the good development of the other. Of two brothers, one has remained more at home, the other has gone out into the world. Yet even the stay at home, though to a lesser degree, is by no means the copy of his parent. The character of each is a fresh creation, and the excellences of each, though kindred, are yet distinct. As society is the richer for both brothers, so it is, I think, with the teachings both of Rabbinic Judaism and of Christianity. I hope that this anthology may show that we moderns of today are the richer for possessing both. From both we may learn, from both we may go forward, applying, modifying, and expanding. Adapted to modern ideas, are phrased along modern lines, there is possibly some value in the teaching of Maimonides that Christianity and Islam were divinely appointed, though by no means wholly true religions intended by God to bring the world by stages to the purest knowledge and worship of himself. In this connection, the following lines of Solomon ibn Geberol are of interest. Thou art the God of gods and the Lord of lords, ruler of beings, celestial and terrestrial, for all creatures are thy witnesses, and by the glory of this thy name every creature is bound to thy service. Thou art God, and all things formed are thy servants and worshippers. Yet it is not thy glory diminished by yet is not thy glory diminished by reason of those that worship aught besides thee. For the yearning of them all is to draw nigh thee. This passage is cited from his Royal Crown, edition I. Zengel and I. Davidson, Philadelphia, 1923, 886 to 70-76, a poem which is read after service on the eve of the Day of Atonement. This sentiment recalls Wordsworth's Ode to Duty. If we get into that, the worshiping aught besides the, because Jesus is the new Baal, son of El, allegedly, right? Glad hearts without reproach are blot, who do thy work and know it not. Solomon ibn Geberol was born 1022. His Fons Vitae was a famous textbook of the medieval philosophers, and its author was known to them as Evesebron, or is it Evikabron? And so, for centuries, Geberol marched through the philosophic schools of medieval Europe, some taking him for a Christian and some for a Mohammedan Muslim, none suspecting that he was a Jew. It was on the 12th of November, 1846, that the learned world was startled by the announcement of Solomon Munk in the Literaturblatt to Orient that the well-known scholastic Evesebron was identical with the still better-known Solomon ibn Geberol. Same source, 32. H.L. The teaching has many implications and can be pushed rather far. It can be expanded so as to include the view that in any one religion there may be development, a shedding of error and an increase of truth, or even an increase and acceptance of error for the sake of the ultimate emergence of a fuller truth. We may conceive of three great theistic religions, all making their long concurrent contributions to the finer and fuller monotheism of the future. Well, Christianity definitely isn't monotheism. Some forms of Judaism, because of their angel and saint worship, can't really be considered monotheism either. And another familiar thought suggests itself here. It may well be that one religion and even a particular phase or form of one religion may be more suited to a given age, a given nation, a given individual than another. Could any kind of Christianity have been so suited to certain peoples or races in the world as Islam has been, or even still is? Because Islam didn't require the ethnic. The ethnic was a way to express it, so therefore it could go anywhere. Could any sort of Judaism have won such conquests as Christianity has won and is still winning? Within Christianity, again, Catholicism may suit some peoples, but Protestantism may suit others. Within the limits of England, have we not seen remarkable religious results produced by the Salvation Army? Would or could any other kind of Christianity have produced them? Would any kind of Judaism have produced them? And yet they were partly produced by a combination of doctrines, some of which, at any rate, many Christians today, as well as all Jews, would consider erroneous. So whether we think of the rabbis and of any other body of religious teachers, we must be gentle and tender towards doctrines which, however inadequate or even false we may ourselves consider them to be, have yet contributed to the religious and moral improvement, refreshment, and fortifying of hundreds of our fellow men, whether in the present or in the past. I have to allow that certain special interests have also prompted me to the attempt of this anthology. I am a liberal Jew, differing even far more widely than a modern Orthodox Jew from the religion of the rabbis, yet my Judaism comes to me through them and is a development of theirs. Secondly, much of their religious teaching seems to me fine and noteworthy. It contains many flowers. An anthology is possible. Some of it, even though we can no longer accept it, is yet striking and beautiful. Some of it is capable of adaptation, enlargement, and purification. Some of it is pathetic, showing the conflict between higher and lower impulses, or revealing a struggle of advancing thought against the bonds of a cruel dogma, namely the perfection and inspired character of every Old Testament utterance. Well, the Jew wouldn't call it Old Testament. I mean, doctrinally, that's not the right approach. And Jesus in the Bible said he was going to restore things. So, he was refurbishing it, making it new. It wasn't supposed to be some different religion, or at least not a different religion from the prophets, which made progress in certain directions difficult or impossible.